Hello, everyone. My name is John Stewart. I'm the executive director of the Miami Beach Urban Studios, which on normal circumstances are located at on Lincoln Road in Miami Beach. And on these circumstances, we are in going virtual and hosting events, in this case with the Betsy Hotel, a very close neighbor to ours, both physically and obviously kind of emotionally and spiritually. And we came up with a project called Zen and the Art of, and we've been looking at poetry, we've been looking at music and at architecture. We'll be looking at photography, and tonight we'll be looking at Zen and the Art of poetry with Campbell McGrath. And I'm here with Deborah Briggs, who is co-hosting this with me, and I'm going to let Deborah take over from here, but I hope you have a good time. You'll be on mute, and you can send me questions during the presentation or this time that we have together with Campbell in his lovely living room with some of his artworks above him. And then just send them to me, the host, and I will try to pass them along as best I can. So with that, I'm passing this over to Deborah, and I'm unmuting you, Deborah. There you go.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Deborah Briggs, and I'm Vice President for Arts and Community at the Betsy Hotel on Ocean Drive. And with my brother, I founded the Betsy Writers Room. And the reason I tell you that is our friendship and partnership with Campbell goes all the way back to the opening of the Writers Room. He's been a tremendous partner of the Betsy's. I wanted to tell you a little bit about Campbell tonight before he reads, just so you get a sense for his tremendous career. Campbell McGrath is a poet whose work is characterized by lyrical skill, intellectual breadth, and humor. One of his recent works, Spring Comes to Chicago, is noted for its reflective intelligence and comic ebullience. In it, as in his other work, he combines both a personal and acute historical consciousness as he maps the social, cultural, and natural landscapes of America. He has a grand vision, raw energy, and keen ear for the subtleties of the modern condition. And that has led critics to compare him to Allen Ginsberg and William Carlos Williams, two other great poets. Though his work is a reflection of our age and society, McGrath has its own unique voice. It's an expansive prose poetry that accumulates images and metaphors through the use of symbols and tangible everyday details. And most of us who know Campbell as a friend know that he is a genius, but the MacArthur Foundation called him one actually many years ago now, and that little excerpt I read you was from their website. Now, just a little bit more, he's the Philip and Patricia Frost Professor of Creative Writing and a Professor of English at Florida International University, and the author of many, many books. He's a Guggenheim Fellowship winner. He's won the Kingsley Tufts Prize, and his poetry has appeared in the New Yorker, Harper's, the Atlantic, and on the op-ed page of the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're really proud of Campbell, and we're proud that his poetry is included on the Betsy Poetry Rail. That's a rail my family created of 12 writers who shaped Miami culture. Campbell's poem, Hemingway Dines on Boiled Shrimp and Beer, appears on the Betsy Poetry Rail, and I urge you to go see it. It's a lot of fun. Thank you so much for sharing your talents with us tonight, Campbell, on celebrating National Poetry Month with us. So we're celebrating National Poetry Month and celebrating great poetry, something the world needs now more than ever, as we all know. Thanks, Campbell. I pass it to you.
Thank you, Deborah, especially since I see that you are phoning in from the International Space Station, and that must be a very trying circumstance for you. And thank you, John and MBUS, for continuing to put culture and life out there in these complicated times. I've learned that I'm much more comfortable in the real three-dimensional world than I am in this virtual landscape.
Totally, I totally am with you on that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it should be easier.
Yeah.
Theoretically, I find it harder, strangely. So,
yeah.
So this is my first online reading. But I think we're going to enjoy it. Also, I hope everybody has a glass of extra large glass of rosé.
Okay.
Or some other.
Cheers.
Another happy hour beverage. This is Zen and the Art of Poetry. We are supposed to be enjoying the spiritual and material peace and comfort of art in these trying times. So This event is Miami Beach centric, sponsored by two, of Miami Beach's essential cultural organizations. I'm gonna read poems about Miami Beach, the whole crazy thing, which has been my home for 27 some years now. I see lots of friends and family out there, which is fun. Your pictures are leaping in front of my eyes, slightly distracted, but let's not worry about that. So I'm going to read basically three little groups of 3 poems each. So I'm going to start with 3 old poems about Miami Beach. These are from my book, Florida Poems. This one's called The Orange. Gone to swim after walking the boys to school. Both of the boys are online right now. I'm looking at their faces too. No longer walking them to school, sadly. Gone to swim after walking the boys to school. Overcast morning, midweek, off-season. Few souls to brave the warm, storm-tossed waves. Not wild, but rough for this tranquil coast. Swimming now, in rhythm, arm over arm. Let the ocean buoy the body and the legs work little. Wave overhead, crash and roll with it. Breathe, stretch and build, windmill, climb the foam. Breathe, breathe. Traveling downwind, I make good time and spot the marker by which I know to halt and forge my way ashore. Who am I to question the current? Surely this, peace abiding. Walking back along the beach, I mark the signs of erosion, bide the usual flotsam of seagrass and fan coral, afloat from somebody's fish crusted with sponge and barnacles, and then I find the orange. Single irradiant sphere on the sand, tide-washed, glistening as if newborn, an orb, miraculous fruit in all that sweep of horizon, the only point of color. Cross-legged on my towel, I let the juice course and mingle with the film of salt on my lips and the sand in my beard as I steadily peel and eat it. Considering the ancient lineage of this fruit, the long history of its dispersal around the globe on currents of animal and human migration, and in light of the important citrus industry to the state of Florida, I will not claim it was the best and sweetest orange in the world, though it was. Oh, great salt water of eternity. Oh, strange and bountiful orchard. The poem entirely describes my sense of arrival in Miami Beach 27 years ago, like as if one had washed ashore on Martian or other landscape of such vast what one was used to. Here's a kindred poem, Time, another citrus-based Florida poem, a very, very short poem. The key line. Curiously yellow hand grenade of flavor, Molotov cocktail for a revolution against the bland. That's the poem. It's a poem. It turns out to be a little bit of Ars Poetica, and that poetry similarly comes in a small packs an outsized revolutionary punch, cultural punch.
So Campbell, let me just, you're reading one more and then we'll do some questions. I have some questions already from our audience. They're
read one more kind of older, kind of my arrival in Miami Beach years ago. I had arrived in a foreign land. Again, it seems that way. This is at the Royal Palm Barber Shop. We live on Royal Palm Avenue, and the Royal Palm Barber Shop was for years and years located just down in the corner. It's changed hands finally. But I do mention, I don't know if Eddie's watching tonight, Eddie Pereira, who cut my hair for about 25 years, retired and moved to the west coast of Florida with his daughter. But he's a Facebook friend of mine, so I know he and his wife had, I think, their 60th anniversary recently.
Wow.
At the Royal Palm Barber Shop. At the Royal Palm Barber Shop, I am hailed by bells. I am called young fellow. I reside within Nautilus chambers of memory. At the Royal Palm Barber Shop, we peruse the local papers and rattan chairs, chew upon unlit El Productos, jig the palomino tassels of ours while we wait. The heavy pedestal ball glass ashtrays carol the tunes of yesteryear, anachronistic as barroom cuspidors, as the blue medicinal vials of aqua velva, encrypted in lost codes of tonic and dust. The do's and don'ts of handsome hair adorn the paneled walls. Travel posters bespeaking identity, Jerusalem and Havana, Miami Beach, 3 flags for Cuba, Israel, and the US of A. At the Royal Palm Barbershop, there was no extra charge for waffler styling. At the Royal Palm Barbershop, I surrender to the ritual ministrations of compassion, lave and salve, adoration of the straight razor, the laying on of hands. The scissor clip behind an ear keys the echolocation of bats, nosings of a mole, the fruit rat upon his twilit vigil. At the Royal Palm Barbershop, Kenny displays his diploma from the College of Coiffure, his specialty, the sculpture cut, a practice he works on the weak-willed or unwary. The man on the next chair appears to have drowned within a turban of hot towels and lather, toes unholy as bloated otters in tiny buckets of oiled water.
Whoops, you've just kind of,
Allegiance to this world, I plight my truth.
you've frozen there
Am I
for a
now?
moment.
My
Yeah,
internet connection is unstable. I really hate that. I don't know why that's happening all of a sudden here.
Toes, boiled.
Toes were boiled. They were toes unholy as bloated otters in tiny buckets of boiled water. It's a very musical line. I'm going to point that out to you. At the Royal Palm Barbershop, I am whisked and talked. I pledge again my allegiance to this world. I plight my troth to the fateful arms of the sunlight, shorn of the weight of the present, unburdened of past, little changed and yet renewed. At the Royal Palm Barbershop, you can crunch gumballs on your way out the door, click the tutti-frutti castanets of chiclets for a nickel, crack your enamel on a Jewish fund jawbreaker, or toss a bill for Hermanos al Rescate as you wave so long to Joseph, Eddie, Alex, Ken. At the Royal Palm Barbershop, we are all brothers and saved. I didn't see any more rebuffering there, so hopefully we made it through.
Very nice. Very, very good.
Yeah,
yeah, we had a question about because you mentioned how long you've been here in Miami Beach, and you're really focused on Miami Beach. And the question was how the literary community has changed, like what you found when you arrived. I mean, and how it's changed over the last 30 years. You've obviously had a big part and played a big part in that change. So, is there anything you can talk about?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, Miami has had a fantastic, 10, 15 years culture-wise. I mean, I've been here. It seems to me that not that much changed in my first decade here, or there was a slow change. That's
Whoops,
we're part of Miami, and it's just continued. We're buffering again.
Yeah, you buffered. You started to talk about change, and then that kind of cut out a little bit. But
the book fair started.
Oh, right.
Big literary kind of energy that Miami has sustained. And then it's really flourished in the last 10, 15 years. In particular, Oh Miami is it's the best poetry festival in the country, in my mind, most exciting and diverse. The universities, FIU, we've been teaching great students for all these years. They've gone out into the community. All of Miami's kind of literary institutions at this point are kind of directed by alums of our FIU writers program. So we've had a great flourishing of all the arts in Miami: visual arts, literary arts, performing arts.
And
exciting culture city.
I had another question from a listener, or somebody in our gathering with us, that asked, what poetic line comes to mind that summarizes maybe the time we're living in?
What was the
What poetic line comes to mind?
Summarize the time we're living in?
Yeah. No pressure. If it comes to you, you can think about it.
I was thinking about those tiny toes, like bloated otters in boiled water, but I don't think that's going to be. I'm going to read poems is very much about the times we're in.
Okay.
I was reading kind of throwback poems. I'm going to get more. I mean, I think, the immediate times we're in is a coronavirus moment, but it's funny because we were enduring the slowly evolving crisis of sea level rise here in Miami, which now seems to people very quaint and like a bygone concern.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's still here.
Yes, it is. Absolutely. Well, and just let me remind everybody who's gathered with us, please there's a chat. The chat is located down next to where it says share screen. There may be a share screen button at the bottom of your screen, and you can send a message to me, John Stewart, and I will try my best to relay the question to our exalted poet if I'm able. So.
Should we go back to poetry, John? Yes.
Yes.
Let's do it. Okay, I'm going to read 3 new poems, new in the sense that they're not in any book. The book I'm working on is a book about sea level rise in one sense. It's really about the Atlantic Ocean in a much broader sense in terms of heritage, immigration, connectivity, and our lives here in Miami being so immediately impacted by sea level rise and kind of that future tense. So this one's called On the 3 Forms of Water. Since I learned about sea level rise, I've been binge watching the Atlantic Ocean, but nothing ever really happens. It goes up, it goes down. Sometimes high tide floods a section of the city, which is nice for the street sweepers and canoeists. I'm so used to thinking about myself that it's hard to understand the sea. What use is singularity in imagining that seamless quicksilver commonwealth? The ocean is liquid like the mind, elastic tides of consciousness flowing and probing, interrogating whatever seeks to contain it. Ice is like the body, scarred and fractured, ordained to crack, diminish, melt away. And the 3rd form, fog on a window, ghostly mist, the clouds which adorn the sky in celestial vestments we glimpse as gaudy rags at sunset. What could it be but the soul? We are liquid and we are solid, oceanic matter cloaked in the garment of being. As for the ocean, she is coming to collect us and gather us back into herself, as when, long ago, your mother picked you up early from the nurse's office at school and gave you a kiss and put you to bed where you slept without a care in the world. I hope my mother is on this conference. I see my brother, but I don't see my mom, but I think she's here somewhere. Here's another one. This poem is so new that it doesn't even really have a title. It has a couple titles. I think it's going to end up being a piece of a longer poem. It's a little bit of a elegy for Miami Beach. And it's definitely dedicated to all of my long-term Miami Beach friends, many of whom I also see out there. Oh, there's my mom. I hope she heard that last moment. This is about kind of the spirit of our lives here in Miami Beach over these last almost 30 years. Looking back, the surprise, it's not its disappearance, but its ever having been. The unlikely dredging up from salt muck and blade-sharp undergrowth of something with a passing resemblance to land, however tenuous, however permeable. The pinioning of mangrove sandbars into skinny islands, elaborated over decades with golf courses and finger canals, and a bonanza of palm-encircled trophy homes. A great dream born of the ocean and to its briny bosom returned. Such shall be the judgment of the disinterested future, tut-tutting our folly, which indeed it was, laughable, foolhardy, a contract with the devil and the mortgage broker. But who could say no to this deal? A lesser paradise it may be, but there are weeks when the ocean here takes your breath away. No hots, no colds, Only the ambient warmth of wind and tide harmoniously synced to the body's inner weather. There is that moment on the still warm sand, just gathered darkness, cruise ships blazing against the shadow milk of the horizon, clouds at sunset like soft-skinned jewels. It's time to go home. Friends are recorking the wine, folding up beach chairs. But how can you leave when the lights of the millionaires' condos shine so invitingly, though you were not invited? And the hotel lights, and the lights of inbound airplanes, and of the stars flying outward toward the edge of an ever-expanding universe become indistinguishable? Or is it just that such distinctions are irrelevant? We've lived in Miami Beach nearly 30 years now, in a house which carries our family history etched into its beams and door frames, a house which sits, if the deed is to be trusted, 5.5 feet above sea level. Not bad for these parts, of course, to last. Sea level rise, climate change, global warming. It's a problem that needs a catchier nickname. The laziest of natural disasters. All the urgency of volcanoes, tsunamis, earthquakes, replaced by dull implacability. Not a cataclysm so much as a dispossession of assets. We don't even need to get our shoes wet.
Campbell, I don't know if you can hear me.
To the young, it seems an injustice. Am I buffering?
Shoes wet was the, yeah, and then you buffered.
What do you heard was a seizure of assets?
Shoes wet.
We don't even need to get our shoes wet. It only wants our beaches, harbors, neighbors, cities, homes. That was like the tragic payoff line.
Yeah, I know. I was really hanging on it. I mean.
Okay, what can I do? To the young, it seems an injustice perpetrated against them by thoughtless and self-indulgent boomers. To me, it's tragic, yet strangely inevitable. I'm finding it harder year by year to separate my concern for the planet from the specter of my own mortality, projecting the movie of my melancholy upon the ocean's screen. Why not? We are both middle-aged, me and the Atlantic. We could be cranking ZZ Top together, eulogizing the glory days. I recall a world before Starbucks, and it remembers the breakup of Pangea, the sundering of continents into puzzle pieces yearning for Gondwana land.
Again, you buffered just there, Gondwana land.
Well, as long as we got Gondwana land in there, I'm feeling.
You got Gondwana land in there. I'm so sorry for doing this to you. It's a fascinating way to
such epic losses.
listen to poetry, because I kind of get into these, like into the moment, and then the technology just kind of pulls me or cuts you off. So I'm sorry.
Again, we're all happier in our three-dimensional selves.
Yes.
Our current troubles seem no more than ebb and flow, an incremental inundation. Earth evolves, life entails loss, time reigns triumphant. Still, there are those days, the perfect gradient of sunlight, the Gulf Stream strewing its bounty along the coast, and the color of the water in that season, celadon and bottle glass and amethyst, a nameless color I will carry to the bitter end. There is that moment on the sand at twilight that has ruined me for life in any other place. In a world of tidal erasure, what claim can our localized calamities stake? Why, on a funeral train loaded with hungry polar bears, spare a second thought for this shimmering citadel, this archipelago of flowers and beautiful people at play? Who will mourn for Florida after it is gone? So that's a piece. That's a panel of a kind of large.
That was amazing.
Florida.
It's just incredible.
That was the main thing I wanted to make sure I read tonight. That's a world premiere.
That was incredible. I mean, I wouldn't even mind hearing it again, but
no, we're not gonna do that.
I understand. I just said I wouldn't be offended. I did have a question. Are you in
Yeah,
question mode?
yes.
It was really a question about your daily practice as a poet and what that entails.
Well, it entails trying to think as many poetic thoughts as I can. It entails, well, right now, it entails trying not to go, kind of utterly crazy, because it seems to me that the whole mode we're in now is time up into tiny scraps and throwing it in the air. I mean, it's just literally, I don't even know how to describe what the process of what we're doing now is. It's so strange how days disappear, weeks disappear. There's no more demarcations or milestones. And it's so odd we are, which isn't unlike where poets often spend their time, wandering around inside their own heads on a slightly obsessive, echoing cavern. So, it's not absolutely unknown to me, this state that we're in now, but I do have I get up and I try to sit at my desk a couple hours every day, but it varies. If I'm really working on something I like that Miami Beach poem I've been writing a couple of big poems I like recently, so I'm really happy to be at my desk 6 or 7 hours, just, kind of going through drafts, and I lose track of what's going on and what have you. But then you finish a piece, you're not really sure what's next. You open, you're looking at different poems, and your mind's, bouncing around. So it's that any creative process. Some days you've got the good stuff going on and you're really excited to be engaged with it. Other days you're hoping. Other days you stare at the same computer screen and nothing happens and you don't know why.
Well, that kind of leads really well into another question about how you write longer poems and how you kind of know when and how you get to the end. And I kind of think that also is a really interesting question in our kind of moment of great distraction. But
Right.
Maybe you can reflect on that in good times and in bad.
Endings are the hardest part of poems. It's not, if you pick up a book of poems or a literary magazine, almost all the poems start off well and they don't all end well. Very closure, which is, our fancy word for endings in poetry land. Closure is very tricky. Ideally, closure, is, I don't know, there's a lot of metaphors for it. It's like the sound of a perfectly made box lid closing. It's, we hear it in music a lot, I think. Not so much in Orlando, but I see Orlando on the screen in front of me there. But in kind of classical, in Mozart, when the end is coming, and you recognize themes and chords and progressions. I don't need, and I know the end is coming. I know it's going to come now, and it feels perfect. It's just made right. Ideally, that's what a poem finds. So a long poem is harder because you've covered all this distance, and a long poem. You're juggling a lot of balls. So where to end, which is the exact right endpoint, can be harder to determine. If a poem is very long, it becomes a little bit, I think, symphonic, to go back to that musical metaphor. You've got different themes, different motifs, different kind of threads, and you have to weave it back so that the audience gets a sense, oh, this must be the end coming, and then you get just the right amount of repetition with variation, and there you go.
You've been obviously producing poetry for a number of decades. I love that idea of being middle-aged like the Atlantic. And what's the oldest, this is somebody asked, so what the oldest poem is that you're working on or that you're revising? Like how far back do you have poems from the early days that you still kind of go back and look at?
Well, I'm working on, as I said, on this big Atlantic Ocean book, and that stuff is all new. But before that book comes into the world, I'll have another book out of like poems, and some of those, a lot of that is new. I have new ones I've been writing that I'm very excited about. But some of those, I really went back and stumbled on some kind of pieces in like journals and stuff. One of those has got to be 30 years old.
Oh, wow.
I found it in an old notebook about Chicago before, 30 years ago. And I just said, oh, I like this. Whatever happened to this idea? And I picked it up and beat on it for a while with hammers until I said, okay, I think this is going to be a poem. I don't do that very often, but because again, I kind of have projecty projects in which I'm generating work towards a goal, and others where I'm like, what other kind of fun poems are around and how might they, interact with each other? So so that's, but it's not like, I mean, a famous example of this is the poet Elizabeth Bishop, who famously had this poem where someone visited her in Brazil and this poem was tacked to her wall. And then they visited her 25 years later in Cambridge and the same poem was still tacked to her wall as like a work in progress.
Right. Right.
I'm not the perfectionist she was. So not every poem of mine has been being actively worked on for 25 years. No.
Yeah. No. And in the art world, Da Vinci was famous for just keeping things with him and constantly going and retouching them and things like this. So let me get to another question. Boy, the chat is kind of going pretty fast. I'm trying to keep up with it. Let me see. There was one down here. So somebody said, does it feel like we're living on the edge? Is that not like poetry itself? That was kind of maybe a little more rhetorical. Somebody else said, well, maybe this is the same person, said, Priya Parker talks about the penultimate point of a gathering, the last call. I don't know if that's something you want to reflect on. And
a falcon cannot hear the falconer. That's the line of poetry for, I think, for our moment, by the way.
Okay. Thank you.
Which has to do with, I don't know, the moment and things. There's a sense, we've been living with a sense of things spinning out of control for a while. And in a way, the coronavirus actually, has both amplified that and calmed it down. It's been a strange, turn of the wheel here, because certain political levels are still spinning where they are, but people's personal lives have been so focused inward that people have had self-reflection, something we have very little of in modern American society, has kind of thrust itself back upon us, which has been interesting.
Yeah. And here's another question. If you were to categorize yourself, what would it be? A war poet, nature poet, some other type of poet? Do you think about yourself in that way?
I would say I'm not a nature poet. I love nature poets. I wish I was a nature poet. I love, I just before this event, I was teaching a class. Some of my students are on here. We were reading haiku. I would love to be Basho. I would love to be able to slow down my life enough to live in the instant of perceiving a beautiful piece of the natural or spiritual world. Our worlds are so fast and spinning, and we're so being constantly self-distracted. We rarely do that. I would love to be that. I think what I'm most, I try to write different kinds of poems. I'm mostly a kind of sociocultural poet. That poem about Miami Beach, whether it's Chicago, which I've written about, whether it's America as a whole and materialism and consumerism, or a specific place, a specific piece of the American cultural matrix. That's what that's what I do. I think that's most also unique in that it's not usually what poets take as their particular enterprise. It's always, again, if I wasn't a poet, I wouldn't want to be another kind of writer. I would rather be a cultural historian or an anthropologist.
So here's another question. How do you decide, because you talk about being this type of poet, how do you decide which events to write about every year in the 20th century poems?
Oh, that's the 20th century poems was really, that was a whole book of, it was one poem per year of the 20th century. And it was complicated because there was 1 or 2 years where I had like 3 different poems for that year. And then there were other years where I had nothing. I'm like, I don't know what to write about. Like 1952, I'm not even sure that was a good year. But how did I decide? So sometimes in a couple instances, I realized later I had included the wrong poem. Like I put a poem in and people were later like, oh, this poem over here is so great. Why didn't you put it in the book? I'm like, I don't know. I thought I don't know. I guess I was an idiot. I didn't know. I just wrote about, I picked up the 20th century as if I was like, I had certain things I knew I liked, and then other voices just jumped out at me. Like, I don't know, from Jane Goodall to like Pablo Picasso, people that I knew I was vaguely interested in, and you read books about them, you explore them, and sometimes their voice, I could channel some voices and not others. So I then attended to their lives and just thought of, so my Jane Goodall poem, I think that falls in the first year she went to start her study of the chimps. And, so then there's a little bit of luck and a lot of research involved in that particular project.
Yeah, I can imagine.
That book was like being a historian rather than being a poet.
Right. But kind of connecting, I think, as you're formulating a century.
Exactly.
So there's a kind of question that's not really about poetry, but asking you what kind of music are you listening to now and what's inspiring and informing your poetry?
Hmm. What kind of music? I always listen to the same kind of wavelengths of music, which is kind of alt country and kind of alternative rock of the, I don't know, post-pavement stripe. But I've actually been listening to less music in the last 2 years than ever in my life for some reason. I don't know why. I'm not.
That's interesting.
Some sort of middle-agedness. The platforms keep changing, and now I have to live stream it on whatever. And I don't know. Somehow, just being able, I know I'm not like
you're middle-aged.
I'm not wishing I had old LPs, but like the dematerialization of music
but
is
CDs.
like,
what was wrong with that?
it's almost like left me behind. I'm like, it's just a bunch of noise. It turns out it's nothing.
Well, along the line of music, do meter and other forms play a role in your compositions, in your poetic compositions?
Very rarely. Sometimes, my poetic seminar, we started with meter and the English tradition before moving through various wavelengths and getting all the way to basho. So I think T.S. Eliot coined the phrase "the ghost of iambic pentameter." So the ghost of traditional metrics is often heard in any poet who's read the canon, but few, no, not few. There's traditionalist poets out there, but I don't almost ever try to count my syllables. It's you don't really get me started on this topic exactly in a detailed way, but
have another sip. I was just. I think
artificiality to the actual metrics that doesn't make sense. I'm glad we've abandoned them, but the spirit of them is empowering.
And you mentioned your students of which contemporary, here's a question about which contemporary poets you've taught for the first time recently that you were glad to bring into the classroom and found fruitful with your students.
Oh, wow, that's very interesting. Well, one name that comes to mind is Hanif Abdul-Rakib, who's a really interesting poet who came down, whom I learned about through OMiami. He came down to do an OMiami event 2 years ago, right when I was compiling a syllabus of kind of new poetics to think about with some of my students. And he's a really interesting poet who writes a lot about, he's more well-known right now actually as a music critic. He writes about hip hop and a lot of kinds of music, but he's a really interesting poet. And I brought his work in and people really responded to that really powerfully. I thought that was really useful. It's, someone asked, I was talking to a class at Indiana University the other day, and they were saying like, what younger poets you listen to? I'm like, well, at this point I have like 3 generations of younger poets kind of, or like 2.5 behind me. So, like I said, some of the people I consider younger poets, you guys probably consider, senior. Like if I say Kevin Young, you guys are like, oh, that's a revered senior figure. And to me, that's still a younger poet. So there's that kind of like, there used to be 3 generations ahead of me, and now through the inevitable process that we're all participating in, many of them have moved off stage, and there's only 1 generation ahead of me, or 1.5. But now there's 3 generations of really exciting poets behind me coming up from some of my own former students who I see here, and poets still in their late 20s and 30s. That's one whole group, and then there's kind of 2 other groups in there. Gen Xers and millennials, or I'm never really clear on how all those things shake down.
You have a couple of questions about advice and writing and things like this, but there's one that's just a quickie, pop culture question. Are you watching The Tiger King? And if so, do you have any thoughts on why it's popular?
Because we live in a strange country. Because it's all about Florida.
Does that mean you're watching it?
I'm going. I would be watching it more actively, except that our son Jackson watched it without us, rudely, leaving Elizabeth and I behind. So we're having to catch up kind of slowly. But basically, you get off the highway at any exit in Florida, and there's a 2/3 chance you end up in the world of the Tiger King. Is kind of how I see it.
Yeah. No, exactly. Okay, going back to the poetry, would you give what kind of advice or assignment would you give a poet to help them write about where they live, such as you have?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think for me, for some poets, not all poets, landscape physical landscape is a really important thing. There was a great book that people like Bruce and myself read back in the day by Richard Hugo called The Triggering Town. Everybody had read that book. These days, kids don't read it. I mean, younger poets, poets in their 20s, or, some do, of course, but it's no longer any sort of central text. It's about how Richard Hugo, who was from the Great Plains or lived a long time, found just the act of driving across Montana and seeing little towns flash past, really triggering poems. They just brought that material to the surface. So I would recommend that book as a thing that just talked about it in his life. I've never codified my thinking on it, but just being in the physical space you're in, first as a material landscape, and then thinking about culture, the names of the flowers. Mm-hmm. It's just, I'm fascinated by place.
Yeah, no, I think that, and it kind of leads into this other question about how you think poetry intersects with other disciplines. And if the question also says, if you do think it intersects well with other disciplines, do you know of any other disciplines that it does intersect with well?
Well, I used to be a poetry elitist, but of course.
Thank God those times changed.
While we all recognize poetry's place at the head of the artistic table.
Whoa, you're talking to an architect, the queen of the arts.
Well, I mean, we do need places to live, John. We do need buildings. I recognize the importance. I used to be more or less blind to the importance of poetry's conjunction with other arts. It's become much more important to me, in whatever, the last 10 years. I saw Tom Virgin on here a little while ago. The visual arts in terms of printing, these prints above my head were printed by Tom Virgin. And he's done an amazing, talk about literary arts in Miami. I think the way the visual arts and literary arts worlds have come together to create works that combine text and visual art has been really important. Obviously, music is a great place for the poetry to find itself. I mean, reading with a musician, or people will occasionally write to me and say, I want to set a poem of yours to music or what have you. Those are obvious ways that they come together. So I mean, for me, it starts, you go back one step. I think all of art making is the same, is the important impulse is art making. The notion of having this creative impulse, a creative urge. It almost doesn't matter what form it takes. I mean, dance to pottery to poetry. That's almost a technicality. That's figuring out what you can actually do. I mean, if I had said I want to be a potter, that would have been a terrible decision. I would have been bad. But I knew I had that impulse, make art, create. Mm-hmm. And then, I tried a few disciplines, and the one that worked, A, I loved it most, and B, I could do it, was poetry. So I don't, I think if you have that impulse to make art, you should be very restless with that impulse. You should say, oh, I like poems, but maybe I should try photography. And why wouldn't I try, dance and pottery and and I don't know, computer graphics, whatever the modern art.
Exactly. Well, just while you were talking, Tom Virgin actually chimed in and said it's a good time to read my music. So,
oh no, I'm not gonna read that poem.
I know. I just thought
you were right. It's always a good time to read that poem, but except for now.
Okay. Another question was, are there any sites or platforms that are specifically capturing poetic voices and responses to what's going on today? A sort of space for poetic oral history of the moment.
That is a very interesting question, and I would guess that there are. I don't know them by name. I mean, I see every day on Facebook about dozens of poets who are doing various kinds of projects, reading a poem a day, or creating kind of responses to the moment. My response has been instead to pilot the coronavirus Hawaiian shirt challenge, where I'm wearing a different Hawaiian shirt every day for the month of April. That's my,
your contribution.
Wow. That's my contribution. Thank you, John. That's a great question that is pointed directly at something I'm very sure really smart people are doing. I don't know the right, name to point you at.
So we have two questions kind of about that continue this quarantine moment kind of inquiry. One is, what do you find yourself missing the most during quarantine? And the other is, this could be about any time. How do you nourish and cultivate your seemingly bottomless well of creativity?
I think it might be a contradiction to nourish a bottomless well. At the very least, it's a mixed metaphor.
Fair enough.
Well, I mean, free time, you know, well, okay, let me go to this. One of my very favorite phrases, which is creative loafing, which is Walt Whitman in Song of Myself, where he says, I loaf and invite my soul. So, you know, you loaf and invite your soul, which is to say you bring the soul into the conversation, and you bring creativity into the conversation through loafing, but which is not to say playing Animal Crossing. It's to say actually kind of somehow finding the creative side of tasklessness, just being in the world and letting yourself be in the world and letting the world come to you. So again, lockdown makes this harder, because normally what I would like to do is go walk on the beach, you know, and then take a swim. And I find that to be deeply, deeply kind of creatively and spiritually nourishing, but we can't quite do it. So it's a very good question, what we do to nourish ourselves. I think we do things like we're doing right now here, right in this gathering, is you go online since you can't go into the real world. And
were there two more poems that you were going to read, or did you finish the?
I was going to read two more. I don't know what.
Can you read two more, and then we'll call it an evening?
Okay, perfect.
That's great.
I'm going to read. I'm going to read two poems. This first one's called "The Everglades," and it's a poem I wrote. Actually, the national parks had a project with the Academy of American Poets, where they had poets write about a national park in their state. I guess they did it for all 50 states, and so I wrote a poem for the Everglades. The Everglades. Green and blue and white, it is a flag for Florida, stitched by hungry ibises. It is a paradise of flocks, a cornucopia of wind and grass and dark, slow waters. Turtles bask in the last tatters of afternoon. Frogs perfect their symphony at dusk. In its solitude, we remember ourselves dimly as creatures of mud and starlight. Clouds and savannas and horizons, its emptiness is an antidote. Its ink illuminates the manuscript of the heart. It is not ours, though it is ours to destroy or preserve. This, the kingdom of otter, kingfisher, alligator, heron. If the sacred is a river within us, let it flow like this, serene and magnificent, forever. And then one last poem from Florida Poems, going back to the old days, which is another poem about arriving in the strange Martian paradise of South Florida from the Northlands. And it's also a love poem for Elizabeth, of course. And it's the zebra longwing, which is our state butterfly here in Florida, is the zebra longwing. 40 years I've waited, uncomprehending, for these winter nights, when the butterflies fold themselves like paper cranes to sleep in the dangling roots of the orchids boxed and hung from the live oak tree. How many there are, 6, 8, 11. When I miss the spikes and blossoms by moonlight, they stir but do not wake, antennaed and dreaming of passion flower nectar. Never before have they gifted us in like manner. Never before have they stilled their flight in our garden. Wings have borne them away from the silk of the past, as surely as some merciful wind has delivered us to an anchorage of such abundant grace, Elizabeth. All my life I have searched, without knowing it, for this moment.
That's wonderful. Very, very beautiful. I'm going to unmute everybody to give you a round of applause. So please be prepared. Could be a raucous moment. Here we go. Thank you, Campbell. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful
Thank you.
job. Wonderful
See you
job.
all.
Thank you.